So hello, everyone. Welcome to our California Center for Population Research seminar with our very special guest, Mary Jo Mitchell, and a special welcome to folks who are joining us from other population centers. We're delighted to have today's session be open to our colleagues across the country. We are so happy to have you here. So many of you are already familiar with Mary Jo and her career, but I do want to say just a few words. She is the Director of Government Affairs for the Population Association of America and the Association of Pop Centers. This is a role she's held since 2004, I believe. In this role, she's also co-directed the Census Project since 2008. Among her many prior professional roles, she previously worked for the NIH as the legislative office at the National Institute on Aging and as the special assistant to the director of the NIH Office of Policy of Extramural Research Administration. In 2024, Mary Jo was named one of Washington, D.C.'s top lobbyists by the National Institute for Lobbying and Ethics. Those of you who know Mary Jo know how deeply knowledgeable she is, how unflappable she is, and there's a certain sense that you're in very good hands in anything that Mary Jo is involved in. I can say this from my very early days with the PAA. The first time I was in a room with Mary Jo, I could tell that we were very lucky to have her on board with the PAA. So today, Mary Jo is going to be sharing her wisdom with us on engaging policymakers and the role of the PAA, APC, and population scientists. She's got a formal presentation that she'll begin with, and clarification questions are welcome during that time. We'll also open it up for an informal discussion at the end. So if you have kind of bigger, more thought questions, I would recommend saving them to the end. So with no further ado, why don't I turn the floor over to Mary Jo? Welcome.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here. The moment of truth. Can you see my slides? Yes. Okay. Great. Well, thanks again for having me. I really wish there were more opportunities for me to do this kind of thing. I always learn a lot from all of you as well. So I look forward to our conversation following my presentation. Before I begin, I just wanted to share with you sort of the primary objectives of my presentation today. First, to clarify my role representing PAA and APC in our policy agenda, explain how you can help advance our policy agenda, provide some tips on how you can do that most effectively by communicating with policymakers, share some examples of successful outcomes that population scientists have had working both in concert with me, but also independently to share their research and to also share our views on a variety of topics that advance our field's interests. And lastly, talk about some of the current challenges and how we can get involved and stay engaged with policymakers. Your colleague suggested that I start with some context setting slides just to clarify how PAA, APC, and I define public policy. I think that term may conjure for some a really limited range of steps that are taken targeting a very narrow set of players in order to pursue change or enact change. However, for PAA and APC, we embrace a really broad understanding of all the available avenues to enact policy change in order to benefit and advance the population sciences. We spend most of our time assessing options for pursuing policy changes under these four major headings. Our goal is always to seek policy changes that are relevant, appropriate, and timely. To that end, I spend most of my time in the legislative and administrative spaces. I should note, though, that even though I'm not a lawyer, given the unprecedented actions that this administration has taken in particular, PA, APC, and I are spending more time in the legal arena. Specifically, we're working more routinely with our colleagues behind the scenes to lend our expertise and assistance on cases seeking to restore grants and restore access to data access in particular. Regardless of the space in which I play, there are a number of strategies that I employ that I'll be discussing today. So let's get to it and cover how population scientists do and can influence public policy outcomes to benefit the broader field. As Megan said, I've noted, I've represented PA and APC for 21 years, and so I hope you don't mind if I think of myself as an honorary population scientist. But first and foremost, I am your advocate or lobbyist in Washington, D.C. I represent you before Congress and before the executive branch of government, including White House offices and federal agencies. I also represent PA and APC on over a dozen DC-based coalitions where I engage with my colleagues representing other stakeholder organizations from scientific societies, universities, patient and provider groups, government officials, and data user organizations. In turn, I try to communicate with all of you to keep you not only informed of what is happening in Washington, D.C., but also by empowering you to amplify our concerns and our priorities and asking you to act at key times when Congress is considering legislation that affects funding for our agencies of interest or acting on legislation we care about. I should note, I know there's a lot of activity at the state level, but there's only one of me, so I don't really engage on state level politics. But that being said, I'm happy to be a resource to you if there is activity happening at the state or even local level that you think has implications potentially for our field. Fortunately, I don't do any of this work alone. I am advised and guided by the volunteers who serve on the PAA APC Government and Public Affairs Committee, which we call GPAC. The GPAC is comprised of the past and present presidents of PAA, as well as the president-elect of PAA and the 4 APC officers. In addition, there are 5 members that are appointed by the PA president to serve on the committee, and those additional members sort of reflect the broader expertise of our community. I'm hoping if you're ever asked to serve that you will do so. And I also hope that you'll feel free to reach out to not only me, but also any of the members of the committee who you may know listed here. It's really their job to ensure that they share with me your perspectives and also bring to my attention issues that you're concerned about that have bearing on our federal policy agenda. So population scientists, as you can imagine, engage with federal policymakers in a variety of direct and indirect ways. And while I've listed several examples here, I would say the most common and, in my opinion, most impactful direct engagement that I encourage and help facilitate are the face-to-face meetings that PA members have with policymakers either in Washington, D.C. or back home in their districts and states. At a minimum, I organize a group of individuals to come to DC from the PAA and APC leadership and from our membership to participate in an annual advocacy day. This year, PAA was held in Washington, D.C., so we put a lot of resources into organizing a very large-scale advocacy day, which hopefully some of you participated in which we had almost about 100 PAA members meet with their members of Congress and their staffs. Because we now have the capacity to do virtual meetings, we now do virtual meetings throughout the year, and those are considered, completely common, acceptable forms of engagement with congressional staff. Indirectly, the most common form of engagement with policymakers, I would say, that I think is also really crucial to our sustaining our engagement is contributing to requests for information or RFIs, requests for comments or strategic plans. Federal agencies, as well as members of Congress, will issue these requests for comments either because they're legally required to do so or because they're seeking broad public input. And when we respond to these requests for comments, it's not only we find a great way for PAA and APC to really organize our thoughts and sort of lay our position down on a particular issue, but it's also a way that we can then share our positions with our members and encourage you to consider amplifying those concerns if you choose to submit your own views in response to these requests for comments. Whether you've directly or indirectly connected with a staffer in a congressional office, a bit of advice I like to offer is that don't let that be the last contact you have. You really want to build upon that initial contact, even if it was just an email or if it was a Zoom meeting, because you want to be a resource to that office. Don't wait for them to come to you. I worked on the Hill. I can tell you, I had the Library of Congress at my disposal. There are government liaison offices in every federal agency. I had people I could go to anytime to get an answer to a question. So the idea that I would go through my Rolodex, showing my age, and find that person that met with me is not likely to happen, especially given the time crunches that congressional staff face. But if you can be a proactive resource to these offices, they will remember you. They'll remember PAA and APC. And so when they get an action alert or they get information from me, they'll be more receptive to receiving it. Another great way for population scientists to help advance our field's interests is by engaging with the media. In some of the case studies I'm going to share with you later, you'll see how media engagement was an integral part of our efforts that we organized around specific issues. And to that end, I just want to highlight that GPAC is sponsoring a session at PA next year on how to write and pitch effective opinion editorials to media outlets. So I hope you'll consider attending that session. So shifting gears, I wanted to share some best practices and tips for how to effectively engage with policymakers if you choose to do so. It's really important to first do your homework. When I prepare population scientists for their meetings in Washington, D.C., I provide basic information that I think is essential for them to know before they speak to the offices. So those of you, again, who participated in the advocacy day we had in DC were the beneficiary of all that work I did. At a minimum, what I want you to know is what their committee assignments are. Because if they're serving on a committee that has responsibility for funding or overseeing any of our agencies of interest, that's really important so that you can relate your comments to an agency that they may have direct responsibility for either funding or managing. Second, you want to read their bios so that you have an understanding of what their legislative priorities are. Do they champion a particular issue? For example, one member of Congress I worked for is an ovarian cancer survivor and is very vocal about that. And so understanding that that's an issue where if you had some area of research to present that would intersect with her interests as a cancer survivor, you'd want to lift that up. You also want to be able to thank them for something. That can be hard to do. Not everyone always votes the way we hope they do, or not everyone is supportive of our agencies as they hope they would be. But at a minimum, you can always at least thank them for meeting with us, because believe it or not, you don't always get a meeting with an office when you ask. So their time is at a premium. If they're meeting with you, you can always thank them for their time. You also want to consider what issues should you avoid, if at all possible, or if you have to address diplomatically. Another point I really want to underscore that's here on this slide is the importance of speaking about your research in real world, in a way that addresses the real world challenges that policymakers are trying to address on behalf of their constituents and districts. You guys are really good at this because so much of your research speaks to how to improve the health and well-being of individuals. But sometimes you need a little help connecting the dots for policymakers and staff who don't necessarily see the obvious connection. The other thing I think is really important that I do list here, but again, wanted to highlight, it's important to have an ask. And that's my job. If I know you're going to be meeting with an office, I want to make sure you have an ask. Because there's nothing more frustrating speaking as a former congressional staffer to have a meeting with someone, get excited about what they're telling you vis-a-vis their research, and then not know what to do with it, right? So as an illustration, for earlier this year, I took the head of the data center in New Orleans, Louisiana, to meet with all the members of the Louisiana delegation to talk about a report that the data center had put out recently on 20 years post-Katrina. They reported on how the region has recovered 20 years since that tragedy. But we coupled it with an ask for funding for the statistical agencies that she and her colleagues really relied on in order to produce that report. In addition, I used it as an opportunity to lift up examples of NIH and NSF funded research projects that other population scientists were doing, so I could also say something about the need to continue in providing NIH and NSF robust funding. So it's always good to have an ask. I'll just say it's good too, before you meet with scientists, to get advice from people like me, or maybe your own institution's government relations staff, about the best timing if you're going to go in to see an office and you want to link your conversation to an ask. that maybe bears on a bill that's moving through Congress, specifically an appropriations bill. If you miss your window, there's really nothing more embarrassing than asking them to do something that they really can't do anything about because that window has closed, the bill has moved to another chamber or been signed into law. So I wanted to share with you a few do's and don'ts, and I'm really drawing here from materials that I provide when I do training for our Advocacy Day and other events on Capitol Hill. And these are do's and don'ts for how to effectively communicate with policymakers. Just to provide some overall context, unless you're meeting with an agency official, like at NIH, our meetings there are usually an hour or more. Most meetings on the Hill are not more than 15 to 20 minutes. Also, many times our meetings are not with members of Congress, and they're not always with senior staff. They're with congressional staff in personal offices. And these staff are responsible for very broad portfolios of issues, so they really only get ankle or knee deep many times into their topics. So it's important that you prepare your talking points in your handouts in a way that the audiences you're speaking to can quickly digest, interpret, understand, and use accurately your scientific research findings. A great tip I got once and I've continued to pass along is when you're preparing a handout, and I think it's good to have a handout because that really centers their attention. It gets them off their phone. It gives them something to look at besides you, is to put the finding in the title. And also to use lots of white space. If it's heavy on the text, heavy with numbers, you're going to sort of lose, that message you want to leave with them when you only have a few minutes to really capture their attention and explain the research or the finding. Again, this can be different for committee staff and federal agencies officials because they may be more well-versed in their topics and may have a tolerance for more technicality in your presentation. But even then, they appreciate receiving these really clear presentations because many times they want to be able to use your material for the conversations they're going to have to educate other policymakers and colleagues and within their agencies or on the Hill. It's really important to always mention, whether you're talking or in a handout, your federal sources of support, as well as to mention those data sets that you used to inform your research finding. It can be a nice subtle way to reinforce that message about the need to support funding for federal scientific research agencies and statistical agencies as well. Some key don'ts that I encourage pop scientists to consider when talking to policymakers. Even in meetings with NIH directors and officials, we avoid using scientific terminology or acronyms that may be unique to the population sciences. We really want to be as approachable as possible. We don't want to make anyone feel like an outsider. And we also really want to garner an appreciation for the research rather than wow them with our methodology or our use of certain terms. There are occasions, I will say, when officials want to discuss research or survey design. For example, PAA for many years has sponsored a briefing series for officials at the Government Accountability Office, which many of you may be familiar with. GAO is the investigative arm of Congress. People who work there are experts, and many of them have PhDs or advanced degrees. So they want to have those conversations around technical details. But those interactions are really the exception rather than the rule. Really important to keep politics out of your discussion with policymakers, especially on Capitol Hill, and not take the bait and go down that rabbit hole if someone wants to have a conversation or make something political, because we are about evidence and we are about research. And as a personal favor to me, if you're meeting with a policymaker and plan to share any of PAA's policy priorities, please use our materials and please use our talking points. And if you have a personal opinion or need, for example, a personal casework issue or a problem with your own grant, I would ask you to make an appointment at another time that you can talk about that so it doesn't get confused with PAA's central agenda. I've given you a lot of tips about how to effectively communicate, so I wanted to also give you this link where we still have sample handouts from our first virtual advocacy day we had to do because of the pandemic in 2021. And you can see there examples of the handouts that our colleagues prepared and the one-pagers I prepared to leave behind with those offices we saw virtually that day to share our priorities. One strategy I'm trying to do more of is the use of infographics to communicate with policymakers. This is a screenshot of a one-pager we prepared for this year's PA Advocacy Day, which is available to you on the PA homepage. As you can see in this one page of visuals, we managed to communicate what PA and APC are, what the population scientists are, and highlight some examples of notable findings that our members have contributed. I mean, just a few examples, but enough hopefully to wet someone's whistle so they'll want to learn. And also, for me, the challenge of explaining who we are is been a perennial one. I think people hear population and they think reproductive health and that we have a very narrow agenda. So that's why doing something like this was really important for me, that I could move people away from text and just listening to me, but maybe having a visual that captured their attention. I can say that I beta tested it with a few congressional staff before we launched it, and they really liked it. So I want to encourage all of, just share that with you and encourage all of you to think about making greater use of visuals when you communicate with policymakers rather than text, if possible. I love this quote. Because as important as data and research are, it can't be overstated how much policymakers really respond to and appreciate hearing stories or anecdotes. As an example, during this year's Advocacy Day, we went into a lot of offices and we're talking about grant terminations and the loss of federal data and what the impact of those actions were on our research and our scientists. And we heard repeatedly from offices that these stories were really critical, but they needed us to capture them. And so as a result, we did a brief featuring the stories of 3 scientists at different career levels, whose careers were really being upended as a result of the administration's actions. I can tell you that this isn't new to me. Having heard it at Advocacy Day was helpful, that they wanted our stories. But I've seen firsthand how an anecdote can really sway an office. I recall really early on bringing a population scientist to Capitol Hill, and this was before we were doing these one-pagers, so she was really just talking. But she talked about her research on intimate partner violence in adolescent relationships. She shared a brief story about how she became interested in the topic, who her funding sources were, what data sources she relied on, including the adolescent health study. And then she talked about how she took her research, used it to approach local school district officials, who then used her research to help inform curriculum that they developed to educate adolescents about intimate partner violence, what the risk factors were, and how to avoid it. And that anecdote brought together all of the tips I just shared with you, all of the elements I just shared with you, as well as the elements captured by this terrific quote from my colleague, Lisa Simpson. And so I just encourage you to not just think about your research in terms of the data points and the findings, but also if you have a story to share, that was what will help make you most memorable, I think, to policymakers. So for those of you who don't know, I'm the daughter of a professor and a former dean. So I have firsthand insights into the pressures many of you are facing in your academic careers. And I know that engaging with policymakers, it seems like a luxury when you're under so much pressure to publish, teach, serve on working groups for your institution, search committees, et cetera. So I recognize those challenges, and I'm certainly eager to help you overcome them in whatever way I can by offering advice and helping prepare you when you want to engage with policymakers, especially on our behalf. With respect to rewards, I think you guys really understand those rewards and have a unique appreciation for the reward of seeing your research shared with policymakers. I talked to many of you over the years who really would feel unfulfilled if your research wasn't used in some way to contribute to constructive dialogues and evidence-based policy making. So these are I just wanted to be clear, I get it. I know this is a tall ask in some cases to ask you to be involved, but I hope you see that it's really important, and not just important for you individually to ensure that your research is used, but important for our field if we want to be able to sustain ongoing communication with policymakers and advance the interests of our nation's scientific enterprise as it benefits our sciences. I'm often asked how I know that our engagements have made a difference. And these are examples of the subtle ways in which I measure my own success and the success of our scientists when they do choose to engage with policymakers. And you do have to look for the little wins because it's not every day you're going to get a bill enacted or convince someone to vote a certain way or get an amendment approved or get report language added to a bill. And, as an illustration, just yesterday, a letter that PAA led that was signed by other scientific societies was placed in the hearing record of a bill that was considered by the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. The letter addressed this bill that would add an untested citizenship question to the decennial census and would exclude undocumented immigrants from the from the apportionment base. We wrote our letter because we thought it was important that members were aware that there aren't just civil rights implications of that action, that there are scientific implications of that kind of action, and that it has implications for undermining data quality and access. And even though the bill passed by a narrow margin out of committee, and I won't lie to you, it'll probably pass on the House floor, having our letter in the record was a win, and that was worth the time and the effort we spent pulling that letter together and communicating it and sharing it with staff because we educated people and at least they know when they take actions, they're taking those actions with eyes wide open about who's impacted and how. So I promised to share with you some examples of how population scientists have impacted policy outcomes through their research, through their grassroots actions and outreach to policymakers writ large. I have some historic as well as some recent examples. So a couple of historic examples here. In the last decade, there was action taken on the House floor in 2012 as part of the fiscal year 13 Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Bill, which funds the Census Bureau, that caught us all off guard. It was an amendment offered by a member who's no longer there, who was a rabid opponent of the American Community Survey. His amendment, he offered two amendments, one to make the ACS voluntary, which passed on a roll call vote, and then by voice vote to completely defund it. We had to pivot quickly, working with other census stakeholders who were also caught off guard by this action to ensure that we didn't end up with this outcome in the final funding bill, because the bill still had to go to the Senate to be considered. We immediately started issuing grassroots action alerts to get population scientists engaged. I started making the rounds, meeting with key staff in the House and the Senate, really the Senate primarily, and really worked with the business sector in this case, pulling in colleagues from the private sector to meet with congressional staff and offices that we thought would hear this differently if it came from different players. State demographers really came to the rescue, and I made the rounds with a few of them to meet face-to-face with policymakers. And then PAA did something we hadn't done before. We used some of our funds to strategically place op-eds in papers nationwide that were written by our members. The end result was the House language was overturned, and instead the conferees from the House and the Senate who negotiated the final bill included language that required the Census Bureau to conduct a revised study of the cost and response implications of a voluntary ACS. So that was a great example, sort of bringing together all those different strategies I laid out for you earlier about how we employed all of them to help save the ACS. Another example is how we made creative use of our connections to an influential member of the House Appropriations Committee to get NIH to reconsider a policy that we felt would have led to the termination, basically, of the agency's support for health economics research. We worked with her staff to draft a letter called the Dear Colleague letter that then got circulated to all House offices. And we asked you guys to make calls through action alerts to the House offices, send emails, connect, urging them to sign the letter. And as a result, we got 82 members to sign the letter. The letter was sent to NIH. And it was really, I attribute this strong grassroots action alert that convinced so many members of the House of Representatives to sign this letter, and in turn convinced NIH to at least revise the policy so that its most extreme measures wouldn't go into effect. In addition to changing policies that have benefited our field, population scientists have also contributed enormously to policies that impact the health and well-being of individuals, families, and communities. as well as ensure the efficient delivery of services that the federal government provides. I've shared just a few here. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with these, but they're really important examples, I think, of the positive, far-reaching impact of the work that population scientists are doing. And they're also the kinds of examples that resonate with policymakers when I'm sort of challenged about, what do population scientists do to benefit the health and well-being of individuals? These are the kinds of examples I like to bring to their attention. So this year's obviously been very challenging. We've been faced with so many unprecedented actions that this administration has taken and taken, it would seem, and to undermine our nation's scientific enterprise. Fortunately, scientists, advocates, and others have spoken up, and I think our efforts are making a difference. I mean, I know it's really easy to get discouraged, and that's why I started this list a few months ago, and I've added to it. The font's gotten smaller, believe it or not. And I like to share it when I have these kinds of opportunities to talk to you, because some of these are big wins, some of them are smaller wins, but they're all wins. And it's proof that our engagement and our outreach to policymakers does work. Our engagement on behalf of our field also makes a difference. Many of you may be familiar with the fact that I work every year to submit language that's added to the reports accompanying the Labor, Health and Human Services and Education Appropriations Bill in the House and Senate. That's the bill that funds the National Institutes of Health. And I offer that language every year, always making it different, but my end goal is to get language in the report that underscores why NIH, especially NIA and NICHD, support population research. We include in that language examples of recent advances, and may even use it as an opportunity to address concerns. This year, people who participated in the Advocacy Day, this was a big ask we made of them to encourage members, to encourage the Appropriations Committee to support our report language. And a couple of members who met with our delegations were so, taken, I think, by not only the work I had done, but their request that they sent a separate Dear Colleague letter to the House Appropriations Committee asking for inclusion of the population research report language. And again, this language is just really helps people who are doing the work inside the agencies too, to make the case for continuing to ensure support for not only the centers and the grant programs that support our field, but also the infrastructure, the surveys that we know our field relies on as a public good to support our work. So now that I've made you feel good, let me bring you back to reality. We certainly continue to face numerous challenges. And I really wish we were in a place where we could be talking to policymakers about ways in which we could expand our field, expand research opportunities. I think, at least for the next couple of years, we're just going to have to really work hard at simply protecting and maintaining the integrity of the agencies that directly and indirectly support our field, as well as the federal workforce. And so that's why, again, I think it's going to be really important for you to speak up and get involved. And here's some ways in which you can get involved. I mean, the lowest hanging fruit, of course, is to respond to our action alerts. We make these action alerts really easy for you to respond to because everything is pre-populated once you put in your home address. Love to have you participate in our briefings and advocacy days if you're asked. And again, once you've developed that relationship, sustain it. And also promote our events in Washington, D.C. through your newsletter and again, through any connections you have to people in D.C. For example, we have a briefing next week on December 10th on U.S. fertility trends. And if you have colleagues in D.C. that you think would be interested in attending, really encourage you to do that. I wanted to share with you, though, that we are always thinking about innovative ways to enhance your connection to policymakers. And to that end, I'm developing a pilot program called the PAA Ambassador Program, which is modeled after the Alzheimer's Association's Ambassador Program that will match scientists who are constituents with members of Congress. And those ambassadors will be responsible for developing and maintaining a relationship with those offices. So stay tuned for more details. I think we're going to sort of go small initially because this is, uncharted waters for us. But really excited to launch it and share the details with you once they're available. And also, as I said earlier, we need to be creative, especially in this environment, about how we engage policymakers and find new avenues. And so I'm hopeful that you will attend our session next year at PAA on how to write, pitch, and place opinion pieces in media outlets. And if you'd like to learn more, these are some resources I thought you might be interested in exploring. I really commend the first item that's posted there, which is on the APC homepage. It's guidance on how to write a research brief for policymakers, journalists, educators, and other non-academic audiences. And with that, I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you so much.